Today we're going to be looking at 9.2, industrialization and the case study of Manchester. Before we jump into this slideshow, I just want to reiterate some of the main points from the previous section. At this time period, we're looking at the surge of the Industrial Revolution and the overall transformation of society. If we remember the beginning of the slideshow, we talked about, well, why England? Why did industrialization occur in England? And we have about four major points. England has a large population. They have an abundance of natural resources. All of the factors of production. And England was also this colonial empire. During this time, we're seeing a shift in jobs. We're seeing a movement from agricultural to city jobs. And we also looked at new inventions and the impact on society. Although there were some positives to industrialization, such as new jobs, higher wages, we're also looking at some of the negative consequences of industrialization. There were some serious unhealthy work conditions for people that worked in the factories that lived in these urban areas. We see there's air and water pollution, child labor, as well as this rising tension between the middle class and the working class. So when we talk about these changes of life, we looked at earlier the agricultural life, and now we're shifting into factory life. So factories paid more money than farms, and before the 1800s, the majority of England worked in these rural areas. They were farmers. And we see this swing to urban life, industrialization, and more people are moving to the cities. So coupled with this term industrialization, we have urbanization, which is city building and movement of people to cities. And the main cities that we're going to be looking at are London, Birmingham, Manchester, and Liverpool. All four of these cities have something different to offer, and it also has to do with either where they're located or what natural materials are near them. This table does a pretty good job at identifying this shift in population and the growth of cities. So if we look at, for example, Manchester, in the year 1801, there was a population of 35,000. In just 40 years, that increases significantly. So this is telling us that there's reasons that people are moving to the city. We also see, obviously, the shift that people are moving outside of these countrysides and they're moving into these urban centers. Again, we can see Manchester, London, Bristol, and we're going to be talking about, Liverpool, and we're going to be talking about the significance of these urban areas. But we also need to talk about what living conditions were like. So there was no sort of developmental plan going into this. And when I say developmental plan, I also mean building codes, specifically maybe like what should be in each building. Are they up to the standard of living? Today, you might see that there are, when you walk into a building, there's emergency like fire detectors. And so we have these things that are put in place, but back then they weren't. So we have building codes as well as sanitation codes. There were no sanitation codes. And so these cities start to develop epidemics. We see that this large population, they're living in these really dirty areas, and we see an increase of chloria. Chloria is from drinking contaminated water. And by looking at this statistic over here, in 1842, the British government posted that if you worked in the city, your average lifespan would be 17 years old. Whereas if you worked or lived in this rural countryside, your average life expectancy would be 38 years old. And this is where we're also fueling this increased tension between factory workers and wealthy merchants. Now we're going to get into working conditions. So the average day for the average worker, there's no difference between an adult or a child. It would be about a 14-hour day, 6 days a week, and this is year round. There's no vacation, there's no paid leave. These factories were poorly lit, they were dirty, they were overpopulated, they were too crowded, and we're seeing this influx of injured workers. So it wouldn't be uncommon for somebody to maybe like lose a finger or get a limb caught in one of these machines. We can see that this little boy isn't even wearing shoes, and there was no government aid whatsoever. Later, we're going to get into child labor and why children were used in these factories and why they were in such a high demand. Class tension growth. So we're looking at the middle class, which makes up these skilled workers, merchants, farmers. And these people are living a very comfortable life. They have a comfortable standard of living. In contrast, we have the working class. So these laborers' lives have not improved. We see that laborers are now being replaced by machines, and people are getting really upset by this. So there's a group known as the Luddites, and these were factory workers that would purposely destroy machinery to put them out of work. Because, like I said in the previous slide, you're working 6 days a week, 14 hours a day, and you don't have any sort of break. And so the unemployed would begin to riot, and this would bring attention to these issues. Even though there were some issues, of course, with the Industrial Revolution, um, living conditions, working conditions, we do see an immediate effect. We see an increase of jobs. Um, England is becoming particularly rich off of this, and we're seeing this progression of technological advances. Education expands, clothing is actually becoming cheaper because it's being mass produced. Diet does improve as well. We saw that in the first slide, how farmers were experimenting with like crop rotation and only breeding the best livestock. Workers eventually will win these shorter work hours, and they do have better wages, which is also the reason why people moved from the countryside into the city. The long-term effects being that there's this improved living and working conditions that are seen today, the mistakes and the issues stemming from the Industrial Revolution promoted the things that we see today, such as sanitation codes and work codes, building codes. And the government used an increased tax to help improve, to help support revenues that would then be distributed into urban improvements and developments. So the case study is looking at the mills of Manchester, Manchester being right about here. So Manchester has its harbor, so it was known for this water source, and we had talked about why having a water source is so important because it spurs travel. Merchants would come in with their ships, but also it would help with production. Like I said in the beginning, each one of these urban cities had something to provide. So Birmingham had um, melting metals. Manchester was known for textiles, and Liverpool was known for cotton. But unfortunately, the poor lived and worked in these unhealthy and dangerous working environments. The business owners make profit by risking their own money on the factories, but eventually the working class sees its standard of living rise. So later we're going to be going more into depth about the children and child labor. But children as young as 6 were employed to work in these factories. And like I said, many of them would be injured. And if they weren't necessarily injured on the job, they would have long term health issues. We see this shift in 1819 with the Factory Act, which restricts the working age and hours. And that's something that if we see today, if you're under the age of 18, you can only work a certain amount of hours. But again, we are also seeing these poor conditions that there's pollution within the air and the rivers are poisonous. So you're having contaminated water, which is then going to lead to an increase in disease.